I'm James Rule. Welcome to the Lonely Leader podcast, where we help existing and aspiring leaders find clarity, build resilience, drive performance, and enhance fulfillment. Toxic leadership. That's the focus of today's episode. It's something that invariably we've all experienced to some degree with the leaders and managers that we've worked with. And potentially, as you listen to this episode, it is something that you are consciously or unconsciously displaying in your own leadership style. So the purpose of today is to identify some of the most common forms of toxic leadership so that you're able to recognize it in others and indeed in yourself. Secondly, to explore what you can do to confront it in a professional way. And last but not least, how, if you are displaying some of these toxic leadership tendencies, how can you remove it from your leadership style? That's the focus, and that's what we're going to dive into today. So the first form of toxic leadership is, in my opinion, the micromanager. We've talked in previous episodes about the importance of delegation because we've all experienced this. Having a boss that's hovering over our shoulder, that's wanting continual, almost real-time updates, that wants to sign off even the most minute of details and really removes any sense of autonomy for their colleague to be able to move forward and get on with the project. Now, this comes from a place of fear, without a shadow of a doubt, and perhaps also a fear of losing control. But the impact is truly corrosive because in essence, you stifle all creativity and innovation. People recognize, well, there's no point me putting my own stamp on this because I'm going to be overruled or the details are going to be changed. So I may as well just go to point A to point B to point C and then wait to be told about point D, E, and F. So you stifle creativity, you erode at people's sense of fulfillment in their work, and as a consequence, you see overall productivity fall away. The credit thief is the second form of toxic leadership. Now, you again may or may not have experienced this. Let me give you a couple of the most common illustrations of this, where leaders request their team to build a presentation, to put something together, and then at the 11th hour, they swoop in and they take that presentation, they take over, they present it, and they essentially position it all as their own work. No credit is given, no note is made about the fact that this has all been pulled together by their team. Or an alternative form is that when good things are happening within a business, the leader is passing things up the chain of command, giving updates, but failing to give credit for where the idea or the breakthrough or the particular high level of performance actually occurred, and just wrapping it all together in a very sort of generic, this is what we are doing. Now, again, a little bit like the micromanagement, in defense of the leader that is displaying this sort of behavior, invariably it becomes from a position of insecurity. There's this desire to prove themselves to their leadership, and so they're trying to demonstrate that they're doing a good job. But it's very short-sighted. If you are the credit thief, yes, you may mislead or allow your senior leadership to take the perception that it's all your work, but eventually people see through that. It's a very short-termist strategy because people are not daft. They recognize that one leader alone cannot do all things and there'll be a team behind them. And actually, it erodes their status, how they are perceived by people above them if they do not have the humility to give credit where credit is due. So that desire to seek the approval of senior people above you is very short-sighted because they see through the fact that you're failing to give credit, and actually, rather than enhance your status with them, you're diminishing it. So that's the downside, if you will, when you're looking up, but equally and perhaps even more impactful is the erosion of trust within the team beneath you. If you become known as the credit thief, if you are stepping in and taking the glory of a presentation or passing off people's work or failing to give credit where credit is due, then people are not daft. They see through that very quickly. And once you have eroded that trust, we've talked a lot about the importance that every leader has to make their people feel valued. If you are a credit thief, it is a supremely quick way to erode that sense of value. And you end up with a demotivated and disengaged team around you. And the third form of toxic leadership that I want to touch on today is the blame shifter. When something goes wrong, as it always will, how many organizations, teams, or individuals can operate seamlessly day after day, week after week, month after month without some sort of error or some form of adversity? Now, what's important in those situations is you immediately seek to learn from the situation and move into the mindset of what can I control? How can we put this right? How can we learn from it? How can we ensure this doesn't happen again in the future? But the blame shifter doesn't go into that place. Instead, they look to cover their back. They look to apportion blame. They look to point the finger. They look to protect themselves and allocate blame away from them. Now, again, there is a margin of defense for this because, much like the preceding 2 points, invariably it comes from insecurity. And people, when they're fearful, sometimes lose their sense of perspective on what they should and shouldn't be doing. And there's a sense of panic or fear. Now, that's a wider cultural discussion. If that fear is embedded in a culture, that's something that needs rooting out because it does tend to foster the inappropriate behaviors. These forms of toxic leadership can trickle down through an organization. If everybody is fearful of who is above them, it does lead to blame shifting. It does lead to micromanagement, and it does lead to the credit thief raising his or her head in the day-to-day operation of the business. Now, I'm sorry to say, I have seen leaders, experienced leaders, that throw individuals or their entire team under the bus in the process of shifting blame. I've mentioned short termism a couple of times in this podcast. And once again, when you step back from this, you can only be left scratching your head and wondering why. What can you possibly hope to gain from micromanaging? What can you possibly hope to gain from uh, taking the credit for other people's work? And what can you possibly hope to gain from shifting the blame and throwing your team under the bus? Well, once again, you erode trust, you erode confidence, and you enhance that sense of fear. If people feel that they're going to be blamed fairly or unfairly for errors, guess what? They start to play safe. They stop taking risks, they stop innovating. And yes, you could argue in some lines of work that's what's expected. But in most organizations, you need people to have the autonomy and the confidence to try and improve, to try and grow, to stretch themselves, to find new solutions, and know that, well, if there's an error or two in this evolutionary process, it's not something that I'm going to be lambasted about, providing that we learn from it, that we identify what went wrong, and we move forward as a team. That's what you want. The counter of a very safe, fear-based team lacking innovation or creativity is not something that you're going to derive a huge amount of fulfillment from leading. And also, in that environment, it's very hard to retain high-performing talent. People do not want to stay in an environment that is based around fear, where their autonomy is reduced through micromanagement, where their sense of fulfillment is massively eroded through people stealing and presenting their ideas as their own. All of these things strike at the heart of people's fulfillment. So not only is there a short-term damage from this sort of toxic leadership, but over the medium to longer term, you're going to see a far higher turnover of high-performing staff because they just won't stay in those sort of environments. Now, toxic leadership takes many forms, but there are three of the most frequently occurring examples that I wanted to share with you. And as you listen to this, I imagine a number of you are nodding your head and saying, that's my boss. Perhaps a few of you are actually cautiously nodding your head and saying, I'm guilty of a little bit of this. So if you're in the former camp and you are operating within a team where your leader is displaying this sort of toxic leadership, what can you do? Because it's very easy to say, well, hang on, they're more senior than me. I can't appear disrespectful. I'm fearful of the consequences of calling this out. So, what can I do? Well, there are a number of things that I would encourage you to consider. First of all, set boundaries and protect your energy. Now, this is particularly relevant when we're talking about the micromanager. They will, if you let them, be constantly interrupting you, breaking your concentration, seeking updates, and that just disrupts your productivity and it's draining of your energy. You never know when and where those interruptions are going to come. So you can respectfully start to create some boundaries. An illustration of that could be something as simple as saying, rather than me updating you on an ad hoc basis each and every day, why don't we pick a time once a week or perhaps twice a week where we can come together for a quick catch up and I will give you a full overview of where I am on the project. That gives you a sense of control back. You know you can work towards those specific times and you know you're not going to get disrupted. And ideally, by identifying one or possibly two, but two at the most touch points, you break that rhythm of daily and perhaps multiple times a day interruption. The second point is document everything. Now, I know this might seem at face value a somewhat paranoid mindset to be in, but if you're in an environment where there is blame being thrown around and that blame shifter, toxic style of leadership that we alluded to earlier is in evidence, then you do need to protect yourself. And a simple documented trail of what was agreed when and where in meetings, what your particular contribution was, allows you, should that unfortunate situation arise where you are unfairly blamed for something, you have a clear evidence trail to say, well, that's not the case. This is what I did. Or if the credit is taken for something, you have an ability to respectfully raise that in a way that perhaps you couldn't do without the evidence. So if a leader is sort of fudging things and say, well, I don't recall that, or that's not my recollection. And you can say, well, on this day in this meeting, we discussed this and this was agreed upon. This was my contribution, etc., etc. Then facts will always trump a argument of that nature when a leader knows that you are very much across the detail and therefore you're not going to stand for your ideas being misrepresented or indeed blame being apportioned to you unfairly. When things are all a bit ambiguous and it's a he said, she said, then that's fertile ground for people to do the opposite. The third point to consider is build allies and seek support. Now, sometimes when you're operating in isolation, you can feel almost as though you're misinterpreting the situation. You start to second guess yourself, and it's easy to talk yourself out of challenging some of these toxic form of behaviors. Whereas when you develop alliances and you discover that other people are experiencing the same challenge, then it validates what you're feeling. It also empowers you to try and address it. Now, it's not advocating a mob mentality where you all beat a path to your boss's door, but I do feel that there is a safety in numbers if two or three people come together and say, we feel that there's some challenges, some issues here that we'd like to address, then it's a united front that hopefully enhances the ability to find a resolution. Perhaps your boss wasn't consciously aware of it. In some scenarios, and I caveat this carefully, you may need to raise things with HR. Now, that must always be the last resort. I feel conversation and face to face interaction is always the best way. But when you have documented where these challenges are, when you have other people that are experiencing similar situations, if you then take that to the HR lead and say, this is the timeline, this is what's happening, this is our frustrations, we've tried to address it in these meetings, but it doesn't seem to be resolved, then you have a much stronger position and a much higher likelihood of these situations being addressed and the toxicity being removed from your day-to-day existence. And the final point I would encourage, and I would encourage this anyway, but it has a particular pertinence when we're talking about toxicity, is continue to invest in your own growth and development. Now, that is something that I think is important for our mental health and well-being, irrespective of what scenario you're in. I think it's important to keep learning. We should never stop learning. We should continue to strive to grow, develop new skills, new insights, so that we raise this level of our performance and also maximize our levels of fulfillment. But particularly when you find yourself in a toxic environment, it can become very debilitating and quite disempowering and at times depressing to think, is this it? Is this the environment I'm in? Now, you must try and address it, as we've talked about. There are ways and means to do that with your individual leader and potentially bringing HR into the piece. But if you are continuing to invest in your own growth and development, then you know, well, I'm actually strengthening my ability to exit. I'm enhancing my ability to do a good job here. But on the flip side, if this situation doesn't resolve itself and I need to exit this organization, I will do so in a stronger position with a deeper skill set and therefore raise my level of options and my attractiveness to another employer in the future. I want to finish the episode by talking to the leader who is potentially becoming aware through this episode that they are displaying toxic leadership styles and traits. We've spent a little bit of time there talking to the individual who may be on the receiving end, but now I just want to flip things around and talk to the leader that may be displaying some of these traits. Now, I think step one is awareness. So if you're starting to recognize, well, yeah, I probably do micromanage and I have been guilty of stealing the blame. And my first thought when things go wrong is to apportion blame rather than find solutions. These are just 3 examples, but if these are resonating, then congratulations, because step one's awareness. If you're blind to it, you can't do anything about it. I think step 2, and this is an area I spend a huge amount of time on working one-to-one with leaders, is to understand the root cause, because there is always a root cause. It doesn't make sense on a pure logical level to micromanage people, to steal credit and ideas from people, and to apportion blame unfairly or protect yourself by pointing the finger at other people. It doesn't make any sense on that top line. So there has to be a reason. And when I'm working one-to-one, and what I want you to think about as you're listening to me is, what's driving that? And I would say it's normally one of 2 key camps in the first instance. One is insecurity, another one is fear. And obviously the fear can segue into the insecurity and enhance that feeling of insecurity. So when I ask leaders to reflect on that, obviously one of the most difficult things sometimes look within, but then also to look around them and to recognize that they are reiterating experiences and cascading them down the chain of command that they're experiencing. Invariably, they will have somebody above them that is micromanaging them, or is stealing credit, or is apportioning blame unfairly, blame shifting. Well, then it's one of those old situations, monkey see, monkey do. And unfortunately, that needs to be addressed. So in the same way that we've talked about potentially members of your team talking to you about your actions, you now need to look above and say, can we please address this? And all the same principles apply. And then I think it takes a little bit of courage, to say, yes, I feel insecure, but in the medium to longer term, I will get so much more from my team, and by default, will get more recognition as their leader if I apportion credit where it's due. Yes, you may have insecurities and fear, but congratulate your team members. Let people above you know who is doing well, who has had a breakthrough, who has saved the day, who has gone over and above in their performance. I guarantee you will enhance your perception to your leadership, and you will 100% enhance your perception to your wider team. It is the ultimate win-win. I also encourage you to have the bravery when things go wrong to stand in front of the problem and to protect your team. Their level of trust and their sense of value will go through the roof. And yes, you may cop the flack internally or externally with the wider stakeholder group, but it is worth it, because the buy-in and the trust and the loyalty you get from your people as a consequence will not only minimize the likelihood of future mistakes, but just enhances that level of productivity and that level of performance from your people. And last but not least, if you can step back from micromanaging, you have to take an overview, perhaps listen to my episode on delegation, which will be linked in the show notes. But yes, set the direction of travel. Yes, make it very clear what the vision is. Make it very clear what the destination is. But then establish that your team don't have any skills gaps. They don't need any further support from you to close those gaps, or they don't have a knowledge gap, and then get out of the way. Allow them to do the job. And again, if there's mistakes, jump on it, address it, help them learn from it. But by doing the polar opposite of these elements of toxic leadership, you will find that the performance of your team is transformed. You will feel a whole different culture in the organization. You will retain high performing individuals. In fact, you will attract more high performing individuals. And naturally, when you start to extrapolate all of that out, you're going to have a far higher level of fulfillment in your role. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope it emboldens you to tackle toxic behavior where you see it. And I hope if you are displaying it, it emboldens you to say, now's the time to start making some changes for the good of my mental health and fulfillment, but also for the good of my wider team. Thanks for listening to the Lonely Leader podcast. I'd be very grateful if you could share and follow if the content resonates. And if you're looking for additional free resource to support your continued growth and development, then please do check out our social media and website details in the show notes. Remember, quality leadership on the outside must always start within.